Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 50 Movies number 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I count down my top 50 favorite movies of my lifetime. I say my lifetime rather than all time because I prefer more modern day films because they just have different feels from older films, which I really can't get into. So this top 50 is basically for movies that came out in the 80s, 90s, 2000s to present day. I first began the top 50 series over 8 months ago, and at last I'm getting near to the end and am ready to unveil my second favorite movie of my lifetime. This is the most recent movie in my top 10, and when it first came out I placed it as my number 1, but after that I was given a couple of years to think it over. I decided it wasn't quite as good as my previous number 1 film, so I decided to move it down to number 2. And when I did my number 3 video, I said that I felt that movie should have been number 2. I'm still unsure which one I like better, number 2 or 3. It's probably fair to say I like them equally, so this film for now will remain at number 2. And without further ado, number 2 is Cloud Atlas. To give away a spoiler for another video I plan on doing in the future for my top 10 most underrated movies of all time, this film is number 1, as I think this is the single most underrated movie of all time. It didn't get nearly as much praise or recognition as it deserved, and in terms of critical and audience reception, it reminds me a lot of Interstellar, to which I did a review for earlier and talked about how the reception of that film was polarized. I would say the reception of this film was extremely polarized as well. Those who loved this film as much as myself really loved it, and those who didn't like it really didn't like it. As a result, I think both of these films didn't get the recognition they deserved. If I had my way, it would have won Oscars for Best Picture, Best Editor, Best Score, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Supporting Actor, Tom Hanks, Best Supporting Actress, Halle Berry, but in fact it was nominated for exactly 0 Oscars. It did receive 1 Golden Globe nomination, and that was for Best Score, which it didn't win. However, it did win a multitude of other awards and other minor awards ceremonies, most of them either Best Score or Best Editing, both of which I'll get into later. Now, as I said with Interstellar, I think the polarized reaction is a result of it being a niche film that appeals to a certain type of viewer rather than general audiences. In this case, I just happen to fit the demographic they're appealing to perfectly. There are examples of other films that were polarized, such as 2014's Under the Skin with Scarlett Johansson, but in that case, I fall on the other end of the spectrum, thinking it was a total piece of crap. But in all honesty, fans of that film can make the same case I'm making here with Cloud Atlas, in that it was targeted to a niche audience, and in that instance I fell totally outside of that target. And like Interstellar, I feel many of Cloud Atlas detractors simply did not get the film, which isn't a blanket accusation I use against anyone who didn't like the film because they dared to express an opinion different than my own, but more of it is not blanketly applied to everyone who didn't like the film, and instead is aimed at specific critics and their specific reasonings for not liking this film, which in my humble little opinion clearly demonstrates a lack of understanding of the film's themes and structure. The one statement which I feel is the clearest indicator of this is when a critic says that these 6 storylines would have been better off had they been their own self-contained movie rather than trying to jumble them together and present it as one. This to me signifies that that person did not get the film, because when I watch it I clearly see that all 6 storylines are interwoven, and that is in fact the point of the whole film. If you remove one of the storylines, the whole film just falls apart, and any of the other 6 storylines would seem incomplete when presented on its own. The other common thing I hear critics say is that the film was very ambitious but failed to pull off what it was attempting to. Funnily enough, this is the same thing they said about Interstellar, and in both cases I humbly think they are dead wrong. In fact, I think they're even more wrong here. As in Interstellar, I did think they did have some points about the ending not being as good as it could have been, whereas with Cloud Atlas, I don't think they make any good points at all and are just totally wrong. Which is signified as I rated Interstellar at number 27 in my top 50 and Cloud Atlas at number 2. Anyway, I feel this assessment that the film failed its ambitions is just another signifier that the critic in question just didn't get the film. And in fact, many critics specifically say, I just don't get this film. And that's not to say these people are too stupid to get it, which is a common comment I see on YouTube videos, which I totally disagree with, and I think is an asinine thing to say, even if I agree with the overall assessment that they didn't get the film. However, that doesn't mean they're too stupid. It likely means it's just not their thing, and that's fine. I'm sure many fans of Under the Skin would say the same thing to me, that I'm too stupid to get it, but again, that's asinine. And the truth is, it's just not my thing. So if this film is guilty of anything, it's guilty of only appealing to a certain kind of audience of the viewership rather than general audiences. But because it is aimed at such a small audience, I find it truly unique and original, and therefore it makes me love it all the more, which is why I rank it at number 2. Anyway, as for the critics that hated this film, I think the best response to them was given in the film itself when Mr. Cavendish said, "What is a critic but one who reads quickly, arrogantly, but never wisely?" And of course, that's from the scene in which Tom Hanks' character threw the critic off the balcony to his death. And that is the scene that Hanks cited as the reason for doing the film and one of his favorite scenes to do in his career. But of course, I'm sure he said this with the multitude of humor. And I can certainly see why. Critics certainly have their place, and sometimes I can use them as a useful tool. But in many times, they're nothing but arrogant hipsters that think they know better than everyone else, when in many cases it's just a difference of opinion. If you haven't seen Cloud Atlas and you're curious as to which end of the spectrum you might fall under, the main question I ask you is, have you seen the TV show Lost? And if so, did you like it? The answer to that question, I think, would most likely be the answer to the question of whether or not you'll like Cloud Atlas. Of course, this isn't an absolute situation, but I found that most people who loved Lost also loved Cloud Atlas, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think many of the same aspects that make Cloud Atlas appealing is also what makes Lost appealing. At least that's how it was for me. It contains the same themes of interconnectedness and destiny that Lost has, and many other themes that those who don't care for reference or quote as hippy-dippy shit. Personally, I'm a fan of this quote-unquote hippy-dippy shit, so I quite like this film. I consider myself an agnostic atheist, and I don't at all believe in certain spiritual beliefs like reincarnation, to which this film promotes, but that doesn't at all hinder my enjoyment of this film because it's fiction, and I don't mind fiction playing with themes that don't exist and presenting them as real. I don't think elves and orcs exist either, but that doesn't stop me from enjoying Lord of the Rings. And in this case, I think the theme of reincarnation and people repeating things throughout history is used to great storytelling effect in a truly unique manner I literally had never seen before. Also, I have promoted many other films and shows for being non-linear and playing with timelines in terms of storytelling like Pulp Fiction, Lost, and Memento. To me, Cloud Atlas is the ultimate in non-linear storytelling, as it stretches it to the limits by having each storyline take place decades, sometimes centuries apart, and each storyline is told concurrently together, and the way scenes are coupled together to tell a singular story structure, even though technically there's 6 separate stories with 6 separate genres are being told, Well, I think the word impressive is a vast understatement. It's truly unprecedented. As I said before, each of these 6 storylines are integral to the whole film, and if you took one out and presented it alone, it would feel like a shell of itself, and the entire film feeds off of each of the other storylines, and none of them are more important than the other. Certain themes, metaphors, and situations are repeated and essentialized throughout the use of these 6 different storylines, which is why I say those who think the film's ambition failed simply don't get it, because it didn't fail. It succeeded with flying colors to those who get it and appreciate this style of storytelling. Cloud Atlas contains 6 different storylines from 6 different time periods, one from the 19th century, one from the 1930s, another from the 1970s, one from the 2012, the year this film was released, one from an unspecified time in the future, either in the late 21st century or early 22nd century, and another timeline in an unspecified distant future, probably about 600 years from now. And each storyline has a different genre. The 19th century timeline has a genre of a historical drama about slavery. The 1930s storyline has a genre of a classic English drama. The 1970s storyline is a kind of a pulp detective mystery genre. The 2012 storyline is that of an offbeat British comedy. The 22nd century storyline, that of a cyberpunk science fiction with a bit of an anime tilt. And the distant future storyline is a post-apocalyptic dystopian genre. And yet all these completely different genres are thrown together and intermixed to create a singular movie that works well on its own, despite being made up of all these different genres. Therefore, the film is utterly unique, as there's never been any film that accomplished this, not even close, as this film is truly non-linear, not just because it presents events out of order, but because the time in which events occur ultimately doesn't matter to the themes and the emotional effect of the film, and I'll get more into that in my spoiler section. But ultimately, it reminds me of the wormhole aliens in Star Trek Deep Space Nine that existed outside of linear time. However, it was presenting a scenario where human beings on Earth existed like this, and to be honest, this has been a story idea I've always been playing with in my head, but found it really impossible to pull off. But thank God there were creative geniuses out there that actually managed to pull it off, and I am completely in awe of them, which is why I see Cloud Atlas as a masterpiece to aspire to. What's also great about the 6 different storylines is not only are they tied together figuratively, they're tied together literally, as each storyline that comes before it chronologically features in the present storyline, such as the lawyer who goes out to sea in the first timeline writes a journal that the composer in the next timeline reads, and that composer writes letters to his lover that the reporter in the next timeline reads, and that reporter's friend writes a book about her adventures that the book publisher in the next timeline reads, and the book publisher writes a book about his adventures that gets turned into a movie that the fabricants in the next timeline watches, and the fabricants make a broadcast, a series of speeches that get turned into a holy book that the village people in the next timeline read. And on top of that, there are tons of other repeated motifs throughout the 6 storylines, such as the piece of music composed in the 1930s timeline, which can not only be heard in the 1970s timeline, but also an Asian version can be heard in the background in the cyberpunk timeline as well, and many other subtle motifs that you pick up on more and more each time you watch it. The film was released in a strange way, as since this film was really anti-Hollywood and breaks all sorts of conventions, and as I said, it only appeals to a niche audience, as many cookie-cutter Hollywood audiences would find this too complex or complicated to enjoy. It of course had a hard time finding funding, and apparently only managed to do so because superstar Tom Hanks read the script, loved it, and so put his star power behind it. And that's how many films are made, when an A-list actor throws his weight behind it. But the result was that the studio gave it limited funding and support. In fact, Warner Brothers only agreed to pay to release the film in the United States and Canada, and the result, unfortunately for me, was it was never released theatrically in New Zealand, where I live, because the film needed to find other sources of funding for other countries' release. And although it was released theatrically in many other countries around the world, I guess it never found the funding here in New Zealand because it just skipped theaters and went straight to DVD, which is something that irritated me to no end, not only because I had to wait longer to see it, but because I know the visual scope of this film was one that was made to be seen on the big screen, and that option was frustratingly taken away from me. But luckily enough, I happened to be going to film school at the time this was released on DVD, and we had a private cinema we could book to watch films on our downtime, so I managed to watch Cloud Atlas on the big screen that way. But it was still a small movie theater screen, but better than a home theater. The trailer to this film, which I think is one of the longest trailers ever made, which is 5.5 minutes long, is in my opinion the single best trailer ever made. The trailer, in my opinion, is the kind of like a short film and is an outstanding piece of art in its own right. Since it's a 5-minute long, I won't attempt to add it to this video, but if you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching it on YouTube, as it's absolutely outstanding. And if you haven't seen the film yet, don't worry, the trailer doesn't contain any spoilers like many other trailers do. The trailer is the only trailer I rewatch as frequently as I do the film itself, as it's its own work of art. At first I was worried that the film wouldn't live up to the trailer, as I had watched it repeatedly over the 8 months I've had to wait for it to come out on DVD, but I wasn't disappointed, and yet the film was different than I expected, and a different experience from the trailer, but just as beautiful. So now I get to bring up one area of this film that wasn't so good, and it didn't always work out, and that was the makeup. To be fair to the makeup department, they did have a really big job, as many actors were expected to play different genders, ages, and ethnicity, and in some cases this worked well, as the Japanese actor Zhang Zhu played Tom Hanks' Caucasian sister in the post-apocalyptic future, and I totally didn't even notice until the third time I saw the film. I thought it was actually a white blonde woman, but it actually turned out it wasn't. And when Halle Berry had a cameo as a male slave, which I didn't notice until it was pointed out in the ending credits. However, there were too many other cases it didn't work out so well. As Hugh Grant was attempted to look older, it was obvious it was just makeup caked on. And the male actor Ben Whishaw played his wife Georgette, and it was obviously that it was a man. It looked like a man in drag. And then there was the Japanese actress Donna Bay, who played Jim Stooges' Caucasian wife, and they tried to make her look like a white woman with red hair, and it just looked really weird and just off. And all the white actors they attempted to make look Korean, they looked more like Romulans than they did Asians, and in fact doing so enraged the Asian community. The argument that they were taking jobs away from Asian actors missed the point of the whole film, and the fact that the film also had Asian actors playing white people as well, so that just canceled that argument out. So ultimately I think that complaint was ridiculous. But the complaint that the makeup artist should have consulted Asian experts on how best to make these people look Asian is a very valid complaint, and I dare say that's exactly what they should have done. But in any case, they should have tried to work around and change the writing if they couldn't perfect the makeup, or had given more time or money to the makeup department to make this work better. But to me, it's just aesthetics and a minor complaint, so it doesn't take away from the ultimate enjoyment of the film, which I still think is completely brilliant. And I feel I have to briefly mention the book, as I've seen a couple of reviews that remind me of some Game of Thrones reviews from book purists who hold the show up to an impossible standard because they judge it solely off the source material. And I met someone personally who told me the book was far superior to the movie, but I had also met someone who said the same thing about Game of Thrones, but when I read those books, I found I didn't really agree, and I liked both the books and the show equally, but in different ways, but ultimately preferred the show just because I prefer the visual medium, and I have the same feeling. I feel the same way about Cloud Atlas, although I did read the books of Game of Thrones, basically because I was just getting impatient and sick of things being spoiled for me. In the case of Cloud Atlas, that doesn't apply since it's a singular movie, so I intend never to read the book. From what I hear, it would be another really great experience in its own right. However, I love this film so much and the visual experience of it that I don't want to sully that up by reading the source material. That may sound strange, but that's my prerogative. It's just how I feel. But from what I heard, there are two things in particular the film does differently than the books. One being the way the different storylines are edited together and intermixed, which I think was handled absolutely beautifully. And the other is how the same actors play the same characters in different timelines. I heard one book purist complain about it because it gives a different meaning from the book that the book didn't intend. But so what? Different doesn't mean bad. Being completely ignorant of the book and judging it just off the film, I thought the actors played the same characters thing worked amazingly well for the film, and it really enhanced the quality. Cloud Atlas was directed by the Wachowskis, who are best known for doing the Matrix trilogy, and Tom Williker, best known from doing Run Lola Run, which was number 22 on my top 50 list. I heard many other lump this together with other Wachowski films, making the mistake of calling this a Wachowski's film as well, forgetting that it was also directed by Tom Williker, and it was actually a collaboration between the three of them. Thus, the final product is much different and more unique than either of their independent works. The Wachowskis, in particular, have put out a lot of subpar films since The Matrix, and so has Tom Williker, but this film to me is their best because it's beyond just what one of them can do. You can see the Wachowskis touch on the film in the cyberpunk Neo Soul storyline most of all, as it has the kind of action-packed sequences that they pull off very well. And the ultra-dramatic actors piece of the 1930s storyline of the gay composer has a landmark of great dramatic acting that Tom Williker can pull off well. Thus, you can see they collaborate to make something different and really unique. As I mentioned, the editing and the score of this film was absolutely amazing, so it's not surprising to me these are the areas in which the film was most recognized for. I want to talk particularly about the editing in this film, which was truly amazing. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to edit together footage from 6 different storylines, and it's done in such a way where every cut, every transition means something. All the suspenseful scenes are grouped together, and the more slow dramatic scenes are edited together, so that the film flows with one storyline, even though it's really 6 different storylines. For example, during the fight scenes, they're always intercut between other fight scenes, and the suspenseful scenes are intercut with other suspenseful scenes, and the way it's done is just so amazing you may not even notice, and so the editing is something truly special. So now's the time where I get into my spoiler section of the review, so if you haven't seen the film, you should go no further until such time as you have, or things might be spoiled for you. So if you haven't seen it, thanks a lot for watching, but if you have, follow me to the spoiler section. So I just want to talk real quick about the ending, which I feel was truly amazing and has me in tears every time I see it. It gets back to what I was saying about how the 6 storylines are interwoven and can't be disconnected from one another and form together to tell one linear story. Some of the storylines have sad, melancholy endings, while others have happy endings that make you want to get up and cheer. And it was blended together so beautifully to make you feel different things at once, presenting the multitude of life with all of its ups and downs in a single moment. And it presents an interconnected feeling of the world, and that's hard to put into words, that no other film has managed to pull off. An example is how you see Chang and Somni die off in Neo's storyline, as Somni talks about how she will always love him. Right after that, you see Adam Edwing reunited with his wife Tilda in the 19th century storyline, who are played by the same actors and living out their lives together in love. So even though this takes place centuries earlier, it's almost as if Chang and Somni are reunited. That is, if you look at it as, the way the wormhole aliens would, in the non-linear fashion. And the other example is seeing Sixsmith crying over his lover's death, and then in the Neo Soul storyline, Somni preaches at an interrogator played by the same actor that plays Sixsmith about love, and how those are always connected, and she can tell it reached him because he understood it on an inner level, because it's what his soul was saying was true. As I said, I don't believe in reincarnation, but that doesn't matter, as the overall message of everyone being connected is an interesting one, and the way this film's ending explores it is extremely powerful. It really changed my whole way at looking at the world, and at the risk of sounding all mopey, no film has ever touched me as deeply as this one, so I firmly assert that Cloud Atlas is my second favorite movie of all time. So that's it for my top 50 movies number 2. Be sure to check out my channel for many other reviews, and make sure you subscribe to keep up with my future videos, including my number 1 favorite movie, which will be coming soon. And thanks a lot for watching.